Hello, class. Welcome back. There's just one lecture for tonight. This is for Thursday, April 30th. We have reached the end of April, and we, after that, have only a week to go in our lectures, which is crazy, but it's a fast class. So, we're going to pick up the story back in politics. If you've been missing elections and presidents, they are back for good. And we're going to pick up the story of national politics in the 1840s. The real dominant issue, the dominant topic of politics in the 1840s is an idea called manifest destiny. Manifest means it's obvious, and destiny is probably a word you've heard, something that is fated to happen. The term comes from a newspaper reporter, a journalist in the mid 1840s, who talked about what he called a manifest destiny by America to overspread and encompass the entire continent. The idea here is that Americans of both parties and of all ages were convinced in this era that the United States had a destiny and a responsibility that it should spread, that it should expand its borders beyond the size that it already had, which of course had gotten it through the Louisiana Purchase. There's my cat. And to get all the way to the Pacific and maybe beyond. There are some people who believe in manifest destiny who wanted to take all the way to the Pacific. Others wanted to head north into Canada, others south into Mexico, and even others wanted to go toward the Caribbean. But there were two prongs of manifest destiny that were especially strong. People in the north, and settlement patterns are important here because people tended to go more or less kind of straight west across the continent. So people from the north are aiming for stuff in the northern part of the west. People in the south are aiming for stuff in the southern part of the west. Northerners are looking at the Pacific Northwest, and specifically the area that on the maps was called the Oregon Territory. That territory, which is today the most northwest corner of the United States, except for Canada, that area at that time was essentially an overlap area between the United States and British Canada. Those two countries had signed a treaty in the late 18 teens whereby they agreed that they would jointly occupy that entire section, the whole Oregon Territory, which encompasses the modern day states of Oregon and Washington State, and then parts of Idaho, as well as, of course, parts of what is going to be Canada. So the two countries had agreed that they would jointly occupy that area, and it was very lightly settled by either for a long time just because it was very remote and difficult to get to. It was important to both the Americans and the Canadian British because of access to beaver pelts. And actually, the first American who was a millionaire, a guy named John Jacob Astor, helped make his millions by running beaver and industry there, and then shipping it back to the east and then selling it to the British. And eventually, he invested in New York City and made a lot of money in real estate. So both the Americans and the British are interested in that area, but it's pretty hard to get to. As late as 1840, there were only about 800 Americans in the entire area of the Oregon Territory. But during that decade, Americans began to figure out ways to get to that Oregon Territory. The key was really the fact that the mountains of the Rockies that shunts through much of the Americas was a forbidding and difficult obstacle to get around. But finally, some early explorers figured out ways to get through the mountains. There were passes that were easy to get to if you got there at the right time of the year, and then they blazed a trail that others could follow. So during the 1840s, once that Oregon Trail became a route that others could follow, then Americans began to come into the Pacific Northwest in large numbers. And by the end of the 1840s, there's something like 12,000 Americans in the whole Oregon Territory, and clearly it's not going to look too good for the British. So, the borders on the map of the Oregon Territory, the southern border is the 42nd parallel, which is where it borders California, which at that point is part of Mexico. And then the northern border was the 54th 40 line, so 54 degrees, 40 minutes. And then in the middle there, the 49th parallel had been up to but not at Oregon, was the border between Canada and the United States. But that border stopped when it got to Oregon because, as I said, that's supposedly jointly occupied. So Americans, particularly Americans from the North, are looking at Oregon in the 1840s with covetous eyes and are hoping that that can be an area that they can expand into. Southerners are interested in our old friend Texas. So remember that Texas became an independent country after the Texas Revolution of 1836. And we heard in the context of Martin Van Buren's career how Texas had been essentially a hot potato issue for Americans in the years following. Because Northerners weren't too excited about adding Texas as a new slave state, Southerners were greedy to get the territory, but in the meantime, Texas held its own. Um, so, Southerners are looking at Texas and maybe Texas as a wedge to get into something else. Northerners are looking at Oregon, but together, both Northerners and Southerners believed that the idea of expansion was a good thing. And this manifest destiny idea was really the most popular political idea of its time. Young and old, North and South, Whig and Democrat generally agreed that expansion would be a good thing for the United States. It's worth pointing out, as usual, that no one is asking the Native Americans who live in these territories what they think. This will be probably the last time that I point out that oversight, but that oversight hasn't gone away and will continue not to go away. So this is a white folks idea. Now, manifest destiny would definitely have entered the national lexicon and become a national political central issue in the 1840s just because it was so incredibly popular. But in the end, it entered the highest ranks of American politics through the presidency of James K. Polk, who was elected as the Democratic nominee in 1844. And I mentioned him previously in the context of Martin Van Buren, how Van Buren thought that that was the year that he was going to get the Democratic nomination again. But because Texas became a big issue again that year, and because Polk was more pro Texas, the Southerners in the Democratic Party essentially pushed Van Buren aside and helped get the nomination for James K. Polk, who honestly, outside of Tennessee, almost nobody had ever heard of. Polk is considered by some the most successful president in American history, which will shock you to hear because until about 3 minutes ago, you probably had never heard his name. Polk ran for president on the Democratic candidate as the Democratic candidate in 1844, and he made a handful of very specific promises. He promised, if elected, he would only serve one term, and he did not run for re-election. He promised, if elected, he would get Texas, and well, we'll see he did. In fact, he's going to get more than Texas. He promised, if elected, that he would get Oregon, and in fact was so belligerent in his pushing for Oregon that although he personally never used the phrase, he became associated with the most belligerent aspect of the pro-Oregon annexationists. There was a slogan that was kicking around in the mid-1840s that summed up the need by the Americans to take the whole Oregon Territory. As I said, the northern border was at the 5440 line, and so there are Americans who, when they talked about Oregon, said 5440 or fight. The implication being that if the British were not willing to turn over all of the Oregon Territory to the United States, the U.S. would fight the British for their rights to take the whole territory. Given that the U.S. had fought the British not that long ago in the War of 1812, and that didn't go that well, I'm not sure this is a great idea. But it gives you an idea of the belligerence, the real jingoistic spirit that's connected to the whole Manifest Destiny enterprise. So Polk himself never used that phrase, but he's associated with the same bravado and the same spirit of annexation, and made clear when he was running for president that he's going to try to get all of Oregon. And we'll see how that works out. He certainly got, well, let's say most of it. And then he made a promise about banks that's not important, that we're not going to worry about. But I'll just say he basically kept that promise as well. So in that sense, some people think that he is the most successful president in American history because he made a handful of promises when he ran for president. He followed through, and then afterwards he stepped off the stage. And so it sounds like his record is pretty convincing. As we'll see at the end of the lecture, I may have some concerns about that record. Anyway, Polk was elected president, defeated Henry Clay. Henry Clay, always a bridesmaid, never a bride, never managed to get into the White House except as a visitor. And this is his last real shot at the presidency. Polk instead got the presidency in 1844 and took office early in 1845. As he came into office, Congress had already readied for him one of the things that he was hoping to do. His predecessor, John Tyler, had finally pushed the needle on Texas annexation and had pushed Congress for a bill to annex Texas, which then was passed through Congress, and signed by outgoing President Tyler. So, new President James K. Polk in early 1845 is faced already with an achievement, which is that Texas has now been annexed. It's worth noting, though, that the people in Texas had been an independent country for almost a decade, and some of them weren't so sure that they wanted to join the United States because they had a very difficult relationship with Mexico. Mexico is their immediate bordering country that they had pulled away from. The Mexican government and many of the people in Mexico had never really gotten used to the idea of Mexico as an independent country, and many of them strongly opposed the idea of Mexico joining the United States, which would basically be the final blow in any possibility for Mexico ever getting back Texas. So the Texians weren't really so sure about the idea of being annexed by the United States in 1845, although the United States was cool with it, and President Polk, the new president, was certainly a strong supporter of the idea. Polk, therefore, early in his presidency, came up with a way to sweeten the deal that got the Texans definitely on board. On all the maps, on all the old maps of Mexico, on all the old maps when it used to be Spanish territory, Texas was a province of the old Spanish and old Mexican territory whose border was the Nueces River. However, Polk reinterpreted the map. And he said that actually the western border was the Rio Grande, or I pronounced that terribly because I'm a dumb American. Um, so, in his interpretation, and it's worth pointing out, like three other people in the entire world believed that he was reading the maps correctly. Um, but in his interpretation, that river, which is a little bit farther to the west than Nueces, that was the actual border between Mexico and Texas. And the way the Rio Grande runs, well, as it goes farther to the north, it goes much farther to the west, which means that if indeed that truly was the border, then Texas was maybe twice or even more, twice as big as the Texas that everybody assumed that it was. So when Polk promised that that would be the border between Texas and Mexico if Texas is annexed, then at that point the Texians said, well, okay, that's pretty cool. And then they went along with it and signed the treaty that allowed them to be annexed, sent a state constitution to Congress, and Congress formally ratified Texas as a new state in early 1846. Now, it's worth pointing out that Polk's curious reading of the map is, of course, likely to anger the Mexican government, who isn't that thrilled about Texas leaving in the first place. And indeed, although Polk may be crazy here, he's sort of crazy like a fox, because Polk had his eye on more than just Texas. Polk was hoping that the United States could expand farther into Mexico. Nobody in the United States really thought that highly of the Mexican government. There's a lot of racist preconceptions about the Mexican people, partly because they're Catholic, partly because there's a large Native American population, partly because Americans just don't think that highly of people of Spanish background at that time. So you put all that together, and Polk is thinking that come hell or high water, there's an opportunity here to get more than just Texas. The first step is to take a bigger Texas, but also if it angers the Mexican government, it might lead to an opportunity. So theoretically, to defend Texas against Mexico, Polk, after the treaty was signed where Texas agreed to join the United States, Polk sent the U.S. Army into that area between the two rivers. The Army troops are led by a general named Zachary Taylor, and Taylor's, in theory, his job is to protect Texas against any attacks by Mexico. But clearly, what he's really doing there, he's there to stir up trouble. Clearly, his job is to kind of rile up the Mexicans because the presence not just of Americans, but of American troops representing the American government in that area between the two rivers clearly is a provocative act, and that's what Polk is counting on. He is assuming that there'll be some kind of repercussions, and he's hoping that those kind of repercussions are things that he can use to his advantage. Thinking also that there might be a war or in some other way an opportunity to get more of Mexico's territory for the U.S., Polk also at this same time sent a famous American explorer who had ties to the region out west, a guy named John C. Fremont, sent him out to California, where he had roots and connections, with the idea that if there was an opportunity or if there was fighting between the US and Mexico, that Fremont would be able to take advantage of the opportunity and try to just directly get California away from Mexican control. California is very much the northern fringe of Mexico at that point. It's fairly lightly settled. Um, there's not a lot of army or administrative personnel there by the Mexican government. There are some missions, and then there's some large farms and cattle ranches. But relatively speaking, given the size of the territory, there aren't really that many Mexican people in California, which meant that it theoretically was something that Fremont, if he was pushing really hard, might have a chance to get when the opportunity arose. All right, so for much of 1846, Polk is hoping against hope that there's going to be an opportunity for there to be some kind of fighting. Um, he has sent Zachary Taylor down to march around in that area between the two rivers. He is hoping that soon he'll be able to have a reason to ask Congress to declare war, but it took a long time, and he got frustrated. Polk eventually started drafting a war message to Congress, which isn't him declaring war, but asking Congress to declare war, in which he was going to use as an excuse the fact that there was money that the Texans were suing the Mexican government for, and that's a pretty flimsy excuse. In the meantime, Polk also sent down somebody to negotiate with the Mexican government because he's got his eye on a lot of territory, and when push comes to shove, if the Mexicans aren't willing to fight, he is willing to make an offer for it. And so this diplomat was sent down to Mexico City to make an offer to the Mexican government, um, multiple parts. The first part is the money that I just alluded to. There are people in Texas that had sued the Mexican government to the tune of $6 million. And the first part of the deal would be that the United States government would pay those people in Texas that $6 million. Effectively, that would be Mexico agreeing to give up Texas for that amount of money, is basically what that works out to. Now, the whole New Mexico territory, this diplomat is authorized to make a $5 million offer to just purchase that outright. And that's roughly the modern day states of New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Colorado, more or less. Area that looks uninhabitable in some ways. There are, of course, Native Americans living there, have lived there for centuries, but not likely to be a place where you're going to be able to grow cotton or just about anything else that people back east wanted to buy. But the idea of expanding into the territory seemed like a good thing from the Manifest Destiny point of view, and then opening up for the next part of the deal, which is California. California really is the sweetheart of the deal here because it would get the United States all the way to the Pacific Ocean, make the U.S. a Pacific power, give it access to trade routes across the Pacific to Asia and other places. That's really what Polk was hoping to get. And so Polk's diplomat was authorized to make a similar offer for California. If the Mexican government was willing to sell Northern California, so basically from the Oregon border down to more or less the San Francisco Bay, then the diplomat is authorized to offer $20 million for that. And if they're willing to sell all the way down to Monterey, which is somewhat farther south, then the total for California would have been $25 million. So essentially, this diplomat is offering, you do the math, it's around 40 or so $1 million worth of money to the Mexican government, which is a lot of money in those days, for the rights to get an awful lot of territory that was Mexican territory, but that there weren't that many people from Mexico living in that sort of northern fringe of the country. Um, so the diplomat tried to negotiate in 1846 and then came back after months and reported to Polk that he wasn't able to make a deal. And it wasn't because nobody was interested, it was because the Mexican government itself in that period was very unstable. And it wasn't really clear if anybody was authorized to speak on behalf of the government. There's a chronic instability in Mexican government at this time. Eventually, General Santa Anna took over again, but for a while, it's just not clear who's in charge there. So the diplomat came back and said, we're not going to be able to make a deal because anyone who can agree then someone else will probably shoot them or something like that. And so forget it. We can't make the deal. And so Polk decided that war was just going to be the only solution, and he's ready to ask Congress to declare war when finally he is told that actually the thing he's been pushing for a long time, someone from the Mexican troops had shot at some of Zachary Taylor's troops as Taylor and his men are marching around in that area between the two rivers. And at that point, President Polk, spring of 1846, got in touch with Congress, told them American blood has been shed on American soil, and demanded that Congress declare war on Mexico so that they could avenge these deaths. Now, it's worth pointing out, American soil, I don't really know. Probably not really, if anybody is reading the maps the way they're supposed to be read. And American blood has been shed, but only because President Polk sent the soldiers down there to cause a nuisance, make a nuisance of themselves, and eventually be so provocative that somebody would get mad and eventually shoot at them. So if anybody's to blame for that, it's probably James K. Polk, but he blamed Mexico, and Congress obliged. Although there were some second thoughts in the North, a lot of Northerners weren't too excited about a war against Mexico that's going to expand the South. Well, they trusted President Polk, who at the same time is negotiating over Oregon, and the whole Manifest Destiny idea was very popular. So they swallowed their doubts, and Northerners mostly voted for the declaration of war on Mexico, with some exceptions. And there are some people who said later, yeah, we told you so. All right, well, all through this, Polk had been negotiating with the British government. And he never said 54-40 or fight. And his diplomats never say 54-40 or fight. But they are leading with that basic idea. His diplomats have been told to be very belligerent, to push hard, to make it clear that President Polk is not going to be satisfied with anything less than the whole Oregon Territory. But after the war with the Mexicans is declared in early 1846, Polk changed his tune because there was no way he could lead the country into a war against two different countries at the same time. He's committed to a war against Mexico over Texas and everything else, but he can't also then fight against the British over Oregon, especially because, well, the British are a much bigger deal in his mind. So his negotiators changed their tactics and offered a compromise, which the British government was willing to accept, partly because they saw they're outnumbered in the Oregon Territory anyway, and partly also because the fad for beaver hats and beaver fur was not nearly as important in the by the mid 1840s. Polk essentially sold out part of the Oregon Territory to get the other part of it. His diplomats agreed that the 49th parallel, the line that was the Canadian-U.S. border in the other part of the country, that would just be continued all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and where it cut through the Oregon Territory, it would divide. North of it would be Canadian, south of it would be American territory. The line goes through Vancouver Island, which everybody knew was going to be one of the crown jewels of the Pacific Northwest. And in a further concession to the British, Polk's diplomats allowed the British to have the whole island. So the 49th parallel goes all the way to Vancouver, and then sort of dips below that when they drew the borderline. A treaty was signed between the U.S. and the British in June of 1846, whereby those new borders were set up all the way to Oregon, and ratified by the Senate with much pressure from President Polk, because as soon as the details leaked out, many people in the North realized that they had been hoodwinked. They had trusted President Polk that he was going to give them 54-40 all the way, and instead he didn't even threaten a fight. He basically crumbled and gave them about 2/3 of the Oregon Territory, while at the same time not only taking all of Texas, but a bigger Texas, but preparing for, if they're successful in a war against Mexico, which all the Americans assume they will be, for a much bigger land grab, which would work to the benefit of the South. And in this combination of events, the beginning of the war in Mexico, then Polk's unwillingness to be as belligerent over Oregon and selling out what the Northerners wanted in Oregon led to fury throughout the North. President Polk was persona non grata in the summer of 1846, and the Democratic Party, his party, which was the party that had basically led the country to these stages, the Democratic Party is suddenly in a lot of trouble in the North. Northerners are very ticked off that the president they think has sold them out. They're convinced that this guy who talked about manifest destiny and talked a big game was really just going for what was going to be good for the South. And of course, he's from the South. Anything that'd be good for the Southerners or to the expansion of slavery in the slave states, that's suddenly what they think is happening here. So there's a tremendous amount of anger in the North. They think the president and the other Southern slave owners have hoodwinked them, have tricked them into supporting a war that's going to expand the South and expand the slavery part of the South, and instead ripped off their chance to get also a similar expansion for their part of the country. And they're mad. They're really mad. Northern Democrats started to freak out because that's not a presidential election year, and President Polk is not going to be running for re-election anyway, so he has nothing to lose. But the Democrats in Congress were worried that there was so much fury in Northern Democratic politics, they were convinced that the Democrats were just going to get swept out of office in all the congressional elections in the fall of 1846, and they got really nervous. They can tell that the mood of the population is very much opposed to the president and very much opposed to their party, and that the whole North is going to turn against them unless they can change the narrative somehow. So, a bunch of Northern Democrats tried to figure out a way to change what this story looked like. Because what it looks like to Northerners is the country has been forced into a war to expand slavery. The country has been forced into a war to expand the South and the stuff that the South wants. So, how to change that story? Well, it turns out that later in the summer of 1846, Congress had to pass a law to pay for the war. And this is the way things work in those days. There's a very small army, there's very little military buildup in those days, and then when wars happen, then they kind of have to, as quickly as they can, get their act together and build up an army and build up all the other things that are necessary to fight a war, as opposed to more recent times where we seem always to be ready to get started because we've got a huge military, bigger than like the 6 other second, third, fourth, all the way through combined. So we're way ready now. But in the 1840s, not particularly ready at all for fighting anything like this. And so they've got to pass this bill. It has to pass if they're going to be able to fight this war. And therefore, a bunch of Northern Democrats got together and said, what if we can add something to that legislation? It's got to pass. They got to pass this law to pay for the war. So if we tack on something that will change what the war is about, then we can also change the discussion of the war in the North, and then we can save our own political hides. So a bunch of different Northern Democrats had this plan, and the idea was that during the debate over the legislation, they're all going to raise their hand, and whichever one gets called on first will offer an amendment, or what's called a proviso, sort of an if-then kind of a thing, that would be added to the legislation that would pay for the war. So the guy who got called on, the member of this group of Northern Democrats who got called on during the debate, who offered this amendment and thus got his name attached to it, is a Northern Democrat, a guy from Pennsylvania named David Wilmot. And so henceforth, this proviso is called the Wilmot Proviso, because he's the one who got called on. It could have been somebody else, but it was him. Wilmot's Proviso, this proposal that got added as an amendment to the legislation, said that if the U.S. won territory as a result of this war, and the legislation is to pay for the war, so that's the connection, if the U.S. wins territory to pay for the war, then no territory it gets from Mexico could have slavery. The idea here is that if they can subtract slavery from the discussion, these Northern Democrats assumed that that would mean that Northerners wouldn't be so opposed all of a sudden to the war, because they would know that if the U.S. won and if it did get territory, it wouldn't really be working to the benefit just of the South. So there's a huge uproar as soon as Wilmot offers this proviso. All his friends all second the motion. Absolutely, We think that's a great idea. And then many other Northerners tacked on, and eventually the legislation passed through the House of Representatives, where David Wilmot and his friends had proposed it. But then it's got to go to the Senate. And in the Senate, the North and the South are much more evenly balanced. The president got wind of it, and he opposed the Wilmot Proviso. And in the version of the legislation that passed through the Senate, the Wilmot Proviso got dropped. And eventually, when they put all the parts together and passed the final version of the legislation, over the strong objections of David Wilmot and over the strong objections of most Northerners in Congress, the Wilmot Proviso was not included. It's a big, big issue in the summer of 1846, just before the war really gets going. If the Wilmot Proviso had passed, a lot of the rest of the story might have gone differently. But there's no way the South is going to go for the Wilmot Proviso. Because as far as Southern politicians are concerned, you're darn right, any territory we get from Mexico should be allowed to have slavery. That's the whole point of this. It's not just about expansion, it's about expanding our part of the country. And so they did everything they could and succeeded in stopping the Wilmot Proviso from being added. And I can't help wondering how the rest of the next decade plus of American history would have gone if the Wilmot Proviso somehow had been passed, but it wasn't, so it's just idle curiosity. Okay, well, now we can actually fight the war because the legislation to pay for it has been passed. In the meantime, John C. Fremont had been given the okay to begin stuff in California. He and a bunch of his friends in California declared California to be independent of Mexico, similar to what happened to Texas a decade earlier. They call themselves an independent republic. They called California essentially an independent country for a while. The flag of their country is a bear on a flag because of all the bears in the mountains. And so briefly, California declares itself the Bear Flag Republic. And then with help from the American Navy, which was patrolling along the Pacific, it did not take long for Fremont and his allies to basically gain control of all of the modern-day state of California and to push any Mexican authorities out. So that's happening in California. Similarly, there was an American stationed in Santa Fe, a guy named Stephen Kearny, who had similar instructions that once the U.S. declared war on Mexico, that he and other Americans in the New Mexico area should rise up against Mexican control. And although they don't declare themselves an independent country, they did help push Mexican government and Mexican authorities out of the modern-day American Southwest, and he then has essentially given the U.S. control over that territory. As for the actual fighting, Zachary Taylor, who had started the whole thing when his troops had been marching between the two rivers, Taylor then crossed into Mexican territory and then fought for a while. General Santa Anna came back to the story. There's a big battle that takes place in early 1847. Polk got a little annoyed with Taylor because he was convinced that Taylor was going too slow. He wanted a more direct attack that would go straight at the Mexican seat of government. What Polk was really concerned was that Mexico would give up too soon, and he wouldn't have gotten enough territory and therefore not have enough negotiating after the war was over. So later in 1847, Polk gave another set of the army under the control and the authority of a different general, a guy named Winfield Scott. And Scott's job was to attack through the middle of Mexico. So in 1847, Winfield Scott landed a bunch of troops in Veracruz, which is the coastal port city of Mexico. After controlling the city after a long siege, then he fought his way into the interior and made it all the way to Mexico City in just a few months, where he attacked the city, took over the city, and then entered the city essentially as a conqueror. In many ways, what Winfield Scott is doing in 1847 is very similar to what Cortez had done against the Aztecs way back in 1519. The route is almost exactly the same. And so the U.S., after a slow start, the U.S. eventually defeated the Mexicans quite easily in the Mexican-American War. The fighting is essentially about a year or so, but there's only a few real big battles, and the U.S. won most of those and gained gained the tremendous upper hand after Mexico had to essentially give up. Um, in fact, more Americans died of disease during the Mexican-American War than died of wounds, which shocked Europeans. Europeans are watching this from over there, and they were convinced that Mexico would win easily because Mexico is fighting to defend its own territory, had a bigger army than the U.S., but the U.S. had a lot of advantages in terms of technology, and those basically turned the tide. So the two sides then negotiated. I mean, after you've lost your capital, you've basically lost the war. The two sides negotiated at a little place called Guadalupe Hidalgo, and in the very early part of 1848, the U.S. and Mexico signed a treaty there that then was ratified by the U.S. Senate in the late winter of 1848. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Normally, I'm not into treaties. You may remember my very first lecture. I said, "Oh, I'm not going to talk about treaties. Oh, I'm not really big on diplomacy." This one, though, I think is interesting. The U.S. gains, well, they already had Texas, but uh, Mexico confirms that with the new border. The U.S. gains all that New Mexico territory, so essentially the modern day states of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. A little bit of the bottom part of New Mexico and Arizona was purchased from Mexico in the 1850s. They're hoping to build railroads through there, which will finish up the part of the map there. But most of that came in the 1848 treaty. And then the U.S. got California, the modern day state of California, all of that territory, a huge amount of territory. Doesn't have the same territorial effect as the Louisiana Purchase, which had doubled the size of the U.S. The U.S. was already a pretty big country in 1848, but a huge addition to the United States in terms of size, in terms of square mileage, and of course confirms what was already happening in Oregon, which is now the U.S. is a coast-to-coast Pacific power, um, and has pushed Mexico out of the way. Native Americans living there, once again, no one's ever asking them. The other part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that's worth noting is that the U.S. agreed to pay Mexico $15 million. And that's the part that I think is worth noting because that's weird. Normally, when a country wins a war, the loser pays them. Normally, if you win, you don't pay the loser. That's not how that's supposed to work. So, I like to think of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo as the treaty of the guilty conscience because Polk had told Americans that American blood had been shed on American soil when he had really set that up as a way to force Mexico into attacking and thus giving him an advantage in saying, well, this isn't our fault, they forced us into it, and so forth. Uh, so he knew in some way that this was kind of a war that was really that he'd set up, kind of a war that really was about expanding U.S. territory, kind of a war to expand the slave territory. All of that was true, and paying off the Mexican government helped ease the consciences of some of the people who were the key decision makers in the U.S. at the time. Polk had a number in his head. I'm willing to spend X amount of dollars to get all that territory from Mexico. He spent some of it on the war, and then I guess the rest of it he gave to Mexico, and then that made his conscience a little bit easier. So the U.S. now has gained a huge amount of territory, and that treaty is signed in 1848. And congratulations to the U.S. and unfortunate for Mexico, and really unfortunate for Mexico, because just around the same time the treaty is signed, whereby Mexico loses all that territory, right around the same time, gold was discovered in California. What terrible timing. Incredibly terrible timing. If nothing else, Mexico would have tried to hold on to California a little bit longer, or fought harder for it, or whatever, or negotiated for more money or something. Um, but doesn't work out for Mexico or the Mexican government at all. And it's going to work out tremendously well for the U.S. because it turned out there wasn't just a little bit of gold in the mountains of California, there was a lot. One of the last things that President Polk did before he left office when he heard the rumors that there was gold discovered in California, he sent people in the army to investigate, and they telegraphed back, and this is just as telegraphs are becoming sort of a sophisticated high-speed telecommunications. They telegraphed back to the White House, yes, the rumors are true, there's gold, and there's a lot of gold. It's discovered at this place called Sutter's Mill, which is in the mountains of California. But there's a lot more where that comes from. It seems like all over the place up in those mountains. And so President Polk, in his State of the Union address in December of 1848, one of the last things he did before he left office, and he died a little bit later in 1849, Polk included a note saying, yes, the rumors of gold in the hills of California are true, which set off the gold rush of the 1840s and into the 1850s, the big American adventure story of the middle part of the 19th century. People went crazy when they heard that there was gold in American territory, and it seemed like all you had to do was get there. So Americans fled as quickly as they could to get to California before everyone else could get there. And in the first few years, at least, you could literally go to the bank. And the same way you would go to the bank and ask for a loan to start a company, or ask for a loan to, start up a restaurant or expand a business that already existed, you could go to the bank and you could ask for a loan and tell the banker, I need to borrow this money because I'm going to go to California and I'm going to make myself a millionaire. And when I come back, you'll get it back with interest. And bankers would just sign over money for that because it seemed as if all you had to do was get to California and then the gold would just be there for the picking. And people just headed there in huge numbers. Suddenly, it seems like everybody in the world is trying to get to California. Now, it's hard to get to because they don't have a lot of the transportation that we have today. You can get there overland, which is basically get to the Mississippi River and then head west across those same trails that people had used to get to Oregon. You use roughly the same trails and then split off farther to the south when you get over the mountains. And that way works, but it can only be done at certain times of the year when it's safe to get through the mountain ranges, and it's also very slow. So what most people did is they went by water. But in those days before the Panama Canal, what that means is you have to sail, your ship has to go all the way around bottom of North America, all the way down the bottom of South America, all the way up South America, all the way mostly up North America, and then let you off at the closest port where a ship could dock. That journey, if you're leaving from New York and you're going all the way around to the closest port to the gold mine region, that journey could take months. Your alternative is you get off at the part of Central America where it's the skinniest, where the Panama Canal would be eventually later, and then walk across the Isthmus of Panama, and then pick up a ship that's going north on the way back. Dangerous and all kinds of problems with that plan, but a little bit quicker. But anyway, most people therefore arrived at the gold rush regions by boat, and the closest place that the ships are going to let them off is what at the beginning of the gold rush was a tiny little mission town of about 800 people called San Francisco. It's got a beautiful bay. It's perfect for these ships to drop the gold rush people off at, and then they can get supplies and head inland to the mountains, which are farther inland, which is where all the gold stuff really is. Most of those people began to arrive in 1849 because they heard about it late in 1848. And 1849 is therefore sort of the beginning of San Francisco as a major national place and sort of as a legendary place. So if you've ever wondered why the football team are the 49ers, there's your answer right there, because 1849 is sort of the mythical beginning of San Francisco. And San Francisco, within about a decade, went from the sleepy little town of 800. By the end of the 1850s, it's like the sixth largest city in all of North America because it's the headquarters and the main supply base for all of these gold prospectors. As they get off those ships, they have to buy supplies, and so the town just sort of grew up around them so rapidly, and it's the administrative center of that whole part of Northern California and the whole gold rush region and so forth. California suddenly has so many people. These gold rush people, when they first arrived, it did at first seem that the stories were true, that it was incredibly easy. And so you alone, or maybe you with up to three other people who were on your team, you could basically dig gold out of the riverbed. It's a pretty simple and doesn't require any kind of real sophisticated technology. You could get bags and bags full of gold. And if they'd left then and just sailed back, a lot of these early arrivals would have become millionaires. But the problem is, it was so easy that a lot of them stayed over and then wound up losing a lot of their money because they invested in another area and they said, "All right, well, I'm going to buy a chance, a stake at this other part of the river that maybe didn't have as much gold." And in the meantime, there's so much inflation there. They're not near where anything is cheap, and so it's expensive to get everything shipped in there. And they feel like they've got tons of money, and so they spent whatever anybody asked them for all the things that they needed, whether that was more supplies or a hotel room during the winter months when they can't prospect. Um, it turns out that if you really want to make money where there's a gold rush or anything, any kind of big mineral explosion like this, it isn't necessarily a smart idea to be the guys doing the prospecting. It's be the people who sell stuff to the guys doing the prospecting, because in the end they're the ones who are going to wind up with all the gold in their pockets. So people who got to the gold rush regions and set up stores or did laundry or provided food or other services. Prostitution did very well there, for example. Those people often wind up with a lot of the profits. And a lot of the early gold rush prospectors, their pockets wound up empty. They thought that that was fine. They could just dig some more out in the spring when the rivers thawed. But it didn't. It suddenly got a lot harder as more and more people showed up, and it got a little more crowded. It turns out after the first year or two, that the easy gold was mostly gone. There's still plenty in the hills, and it's clear. And if you're looking for precious metals, the place to look is in the mountains. So there's plenty of it around, but it requires a lot more sophisticated technology, which is more expensive. And therefore, after about 1851, maybe 1852, individuals really aren't likely to be able to make a big fortune in the gold rush regions. They wind up having to work for companies that have the capital to afford the more sophisticated technology, including things like dynamite to blast off part of the hill so they can dig into where the gold really is. And many of those early miners, if they didn't go home with their riches, wound up eventually staying there and working for these companies and didn't make their own individual profits, but helped these companies get rich. And a lot of the early gold miners really regretted it, and many of them never returned home because they're embarrassed, or because they assumed that maybe their luck would change again, and if they stayed a little bit longer, they would find that one other rich vein of gold, and they could make their millions again. And so most of them, it didn't work out that well. And so the gold rush regions became much much less romantic and much more capitalistic and much more dog eat dog after a couple of years. And what that means is that also the early days of the gold rush, the tone changed. In the early days, anybody could come. It's American territory, thanks to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but everybody who wants to get there is welcome. Just sort of first come, first serve, grab a piece of the river and start digging. But as it got more competitive, and as the mood of the gold rush regions became much more inward and much more sort of angry and aggressive, then the American gold rush people began to kick out people who they thought didn't deserve the riches. So Native Americans, as always, are the victims here first. The Native American tribes of the area were not allowed to prospect after the first couple of years, even though it was their land originally, so they can't get the wealth. Then Mexicans were kicked out of the area. There were still plenty of Mexican people living in California once it became American territory, but once things got more competitive, then the Americans said, "You guys aren't allowed to prospect here either." There are people from Asia, so some from as far as China, and then there are people from the Polynesian islands, including what we today call Hawaii. Um, and those people were kicked out, or if they stayed, they're not allowed to gain wealth. They are going to set up maybe laundries and things like that, and try to get secondary wealth. And then eventually the Americans even got grumpy enough to kick out people who looked like them. And so Europeans, especially French and English people who've been arriving, um, the Americans don't let them stay either. And so it became just sort of an American thing, and then they're fighting even amongst themselves. What started out as seemingly sort of a utopian, beautiful, first come, first serve, we're all in this together kind of a deal, really, really turned into a much more aggressive, chaotic situation. And that didn't take very long, just took a few years. So that's the gold rush, and there's much more to say about it. It's a fascinating time. It's a fascinating the way it sort of the story changes, and it's fascinating for what it says sort of about Americans and what they believe in. But we're going to move on from that and talk about some of the repercussions of it, because the fact that so many Americans went to California accelerated the question that is going to be asked after every war that the U.S. gains territory, or every time that they gain territory not through war, like Louisiana Purchase. What's going to happen to the territory? Normally, what would happen is slowly people would move into that territory, and then eventually, way down the line, the U.S. would have to figure out sort of what kind of territory and what kind of state it would be. Given how far away California was, that should have taken a long time. It should have been sort of a slow trickle of white settlement into the far west, which would have given the country some time to think about what they want to do and to have whatever internal arguments and debates. But because the gold rush accelerated the population of California, at least, growing so much, it forced the issue much quicker than it would have otherwise of what's going to happen to this territory. So, in addition to creating or sort of leading to the digging out and therefore expansion of so much incredible wealth that then the U.S. government really, in the end, gains a lot of control over, and many fortunes are made. In addition to that, the gold rush really accelerated the political problem of new territory, which is in this era is sort of whose territory is it going to be? Is it going to be territory that follows the model of the North or follows the model of the South? And who's going to feel like the big winners in this expansion of the country? That's the real question, and that question has to be answered right away. Because as quickly as 1850, which is just a couple of years after the U.S. got the territory, there are already well more than enough people living in California for it to become a state, based on the pattern of statehood from earlier since the Constitution. And clearly, there needs to be more law and order there. Somebody needs to actually really take over, and statehood would be part of that process because it's very chaotic. There needs to be actual real laws and a real constitution and real constitutional authority over that land, as opposed to letting the miners all fight amongst themselves. It's time for that to happen. And yet, how is that going to happen? Who's going to get control over it? Is it going to be Northern Territory or Southern Territory? Is it going to be slavery? Is there not going to be slavery? I can tell you that if you ask the people who lived in California, most of them would say, almost all of them would say, that it should not have slavery. In the early days of the gold rush, some Southerners had come to the gold rush regions and had brought slaves with them and had their slaves dig the gold out of the ground while they sat there and sipped mint juleps or whatever, and then tried to gain the wealth brought to them by the laborers of their slaves, the way they had gained wealth from the labors of the slaves in the cotton plantations and everywhere else in the South. But that was something that was resented by all the other gold rush miners. The idea that there is anybody who is here who is gaining wealth not through the sweat of their own labor, that really made everybody else mad. And so ultimately, the fairly small number of slave owners who brought their slaves were ostracized, and they're not really allowed to continue to do that. The overall mood of the population in California is that we don't want to have slavery. But that isn't necessarily relevant, because in theory, it's up to the national government to decide, will this be slavery? Will slavery be allowed here or not? And it isn't necessarily up to the people living there. It could be imposed from without. And so this is going to be the key question. What's going to happen to California? And you're not going to stop there. If you're going to talk about California, you pretty much need to decide right now what's going to happen to all this new territory. Texas, they knew. Texas had already been entered into the as a new state in 1846. It's officially a new state. It's a slave state. They'd had slavery there since before they're even part of the United States, since before they're even independent. They'd had slavery there. That's the whole reason for the Texas Revolution, pretty much. So that everybody knew. But the rest of the territory, what's going to happen with that? And California accelerated that process. Now, this is not Polk's problem. Polk had left. Polk went back to Tennessee and died shortly thereafter, so it wouldn't have been his problem anyway. Um, and so people who talk about James K. Polk as a successful president, I can give you that on very narrow grounds. He followed through, although he didn't do such a great job on the Oregon thing. He followed through on those main promises, but he left behind a legacy that was so uncertain and a legacy that's really quite explosive. What's going to happen? How are we going to solve this debate? That, in fact, is the beginning of a series of very difficult things to resolve, where the North and the South are going to increasingly see each other as rivals. And the fact that Polk left that as a legacy means to me that he's not a remarkably successful president if he's helping sow the seeds for what a decade later will be the Civil War. No points to him for that. So instead, who is in charge of the country as you turn to the immediate aftermath of the Mexican-American War? Well, it turns out to be one of the heroes of the Mexican-American War. In 1848, as the war was winding down, the Whigs nominated Zachary Taylor, one of the heroes of the Mexican-American War, as their candidate. And this is funny in some ways because Zachary Taylor, a career military man, it appears the first time he ever voted for president was when he voted for himself as president. Had very little interest in politics prior to that. It's also ironic because the Whigs had been less interested and less supportive of the war. The Whigs are really the more northern party, and therefore they had been the kind of people that Wilmot was scared of because a lot of people in the North don't like this war if it's going to be to expand slavery. And a lot of the Whigs had opposed the war. And so, here you've got here you've got the possibility of expansion of the war, of expansion of slavery, and yet the Whigs nominate for president a candidate for the war that helped possibly expand slavery. Taylor, when he ran for president, ran really on nothing. He said his platform was the Constitution, which, I mean, every president, hopefully their platform is the Constitution, but hopefully they get a little more specific than that. He appears to be sort of politically naive. He has really got no political background. He's getting the job because he's a military hero, because people have read his name in the paper. Whether or not he actually is going to be a good president is very much up for grabs and an unknown. Not to say that someone with a military background can't be a good president, but in this case, he really hasn't in any way trained for the job and is very much in over his head. So, but Taylor is the president, and so it's going to be up to Taylor to get the first crack at answering my question, what's going to happen to this territory? And Taylor, in early 1850, his proposal was, let's take the territory we got from Mexico, forget about Texas, they're already a new state, and let's divide it up. Part of it will be California. The other part of it we're going to call New Mexico. And then we'll let California come into a state right now because they have enough people. And we'll figure out New Mexico later. That's his proposal. It's pretty vague. He doesn't say what's going to happen with slavery in either California or the New Mexico territory. He's vague enough on it that you can read into it anything you want, probably. It appears that roughly what he's thinking is that the people in each of those places would sort of make up their own minds, which could make the North happy or could make the South happy, but is not going to be good enough for the South because the South desperately wants to get all of that territory as slave territory, and they can see that California doesn't want to have slavery, and so that will effectively block how far they can expand. There was a big convention of Southerners in Nashville in the early summer of 1850, where they made very clear that unless they got a guarantee that slavery could expand into the whole territory, that everything they got from Mexico, that they were not going to accept any plan coming out of the president. Well, things have gotten pretty ugly over this issue of expansion of territory and whether or not slavery is going to be part of the story. And it also gotten pretty complicated. So before we continue the story, I think we need to try to figure out what all the threads are in this national debate. Because by the turn of the 1850s, Americans had developed a bunch of different ideas, a bunch of different ideologies about slavery that now, with this debate over the new territory, will really continue to affect American politics all the way up to the eve of the Civil War. So it's complicated. And there's basically five different points of view. You can choose a sixth, which is I don't care, but it's pretty hard in the 1850s not to care about the issues of what's going to happen with slavery, what's going to happen to this new territory. Good luck to you. But if you are caring at all, you have to pick one of these sides. So, working my way from the most anti-slavery to the most pro-slavery, there's five different ideologies in the 1850s. The first we've heard of already are the abolitionists. The abolitionists, white and black, most all black people are abolitionists, whether or not they use the term, but unfortunately, most of them don't have much political power. But there are enough white abolitionists that they can exist as a group, and they had a much disproportionate ability to discuss to get their ideas out because they're very good at sort of stimulating debate about their topics. The abolitionists believe that slavery is wrong. End of discussion. The abolitionists even believe the, for the time, crazy idea that white and black people are equal, which is a radical idea for any white person to say, but the abolitionists believed it. To oppose slavery that strongly can't happen in the South. So the abolitionists not only are a small group, but they're only a northern group. And they include people we've heard about already, the white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, the black abolitionist Frederick Douglass, and many others who are aligned with them. They're a small group. They're certain of the righteousness of their cause. They're not going away. They're not really growing that much. Most everybody else hates them or is sort of scared of what they have to say. Now, there is that other anti-slavery point of view, which had developed out of the Liberty Party and then the Free Soil Party, the people who opposed slavery but wanted to deal with it in sort of a more moderate way. And by the early 1850s, we can call them just the Free Soilers. These are people who didn't like slavery, who thought slavery was bad for the country. Their focus was on trying to stop slavery from growing. They thought the Constitution wouldn't allow them to get rid of slavery where it already existed because those states wanted to have slavery in the South. But their goal was if they could stop it from spreading, they thought eventually that slavery would die out if the rest of the country kept expanding and kept having non-slavery. They thought that the tiny little part of the country would have slavery, and then eventually that whole idea would just go away. So, the free soil point of view, the keep the territories free point of view, those people, because they oppose slavery, not all the way going as far as the abolitionists, the Free Soilers aren't talking about racial equality, but they believe slavery is bad for the country, and that's enough for them to also be a northern group only. There aren't any Free Soilers in the South because anybody objects to slavery at all, their neighbors in the South are going to say, see ya, you should go to the North because we don't like you. So Free Soilers include people in both political parties at the time. David Wilmot with the Wilmot Proviso of 1846, that's a free soil position. There are Whigs as well who believe in this idea. There are probably more Whigs than Democrats. So a prominent Whig of the time, and we'll hear more about him later, is a Whig from New York State, a senator named William Seward. In the debates over what was going to happen to California and this new territory, Seward in 1850 gave his famous speech called the Higher Law speech, in which he said that the Constitution may be important, but he answered to a higher law than the Constitution, the law of God, the law of right and wrong, and he would have to go the way of the higher law than the Constitution, and he could not support something that would allow slavery to expand. So, taking an anti-slavery position, but not going as far as being an abolitionist. He's going to be a very important voice opposing slavery for the rest of that decade. And not an important voice at this point, but just worth mentioning in case you're curious, is that there's an obscure congressman who'd only served one term in Congress during the Mexican American War and then went back to politics in Illinois, and no one expected to ever hear from him again. But where he falls into the story, fairly young man named Abraham Lincoln, would be in the free soil category. He didn't like slavery, but believed that he couldn't do anything about it where it existed, and the goal would be to stop it from spreading. Not an abolitionist, and really never will be. All right, then there's a couple of middle of the road positions about slavery. People who had sort of compromised positions that a little bit could work for the benefit of the South and a little bit could work for the benefit of the North. And there's sort of two in the middle here. Not really clear to me which goes where, but the first one I'll mention would be the older politicians who'd been around when the Missouri Compromise got passed the last time they had this problem. So remember in 1820, as they're arguing over what should happen to the Louisiana Purchase, Henry Clay had pushed through the Missouri Compromise where they drew a line across the Louisiana Purchase at the 3630 line. And then everything north of that line couldn't have slavery, and everything south of that line could have slavery. And that was how they solved that problem back then with that last amount of land. Well, the Missouri Compromisers of that old generation are still around in some cases, and they had basically the same point of view, which was we could just keep drawing that line. That same line, that 3630 line that divided up the Louisiana Purchase, we can just draw that all the way to the Pacific and use that to divide non-slave territory to the north of the line and slave territory to the south of that line. And this is basically the point of view of older politicians who knew it worked the last time. So Polk, before he died, this was basically what he thought should happen to the new territory. Guarantee both sides would get something. Henry Clay, at first, this was what he was proposing, and Daniel Webster, the leading older Whig from the North, who had been around during the Missouri Compromise, also this was his suggestion. Let's just draw that line. Let's just connect that 3630 line all the way out to the coast, and then both sides would get something. Because it guarantees both sides would get something out of this new territory, this is something that you would see in the North and in the South. Clay is a Southerner, Webster is a Northerner, Polk is a Southerner. So you could see it as sort of, it's a compromise in the sense that also it includes people from both sections of the country. Then there's a new idea, and an idea that really popped up for the first time in national debate in the election of 1848, an idea called popular sovereignty. Popular means of the people. Sovereignty means who rules or who decides. The popular sovereignty idea was rather than have Congress impose a decision, rather than have Congress or the president decide whether or not a territory is going to have slavery or not have slavery, let's just let the people who live there decide. Let's let the people who live there vote. When they're a territory, when they're starting to get organized and they're starting to make their laws, they can make up their mind whether they want to have slavery or not. And then when they get big enough to become a state, then they can just decide, okay, well, slavery works for us, so we're going to go for it, or slavery doesn't work for us, so we're not going to have it, and then try to get added to the Union as either a slave state or a non-slave state. But the key here is the people would get to make up their minds. And popular sovereignty is also a compromise in that it doesn't guarantee both the North and the South get part of the story the way the Missouri Compromiser position did. But the popular sovereignty position opens up the possibility for both the North and the South to expand. Because in the end, it'll be up to the people who live in those territories. And they may all decide they like slavery, they may all decide they don't like slavery, or they may split. And some of it may go for the North and some of it may go for the South. But the possibility is out there that both sides could get something. And this popular sovereignty idea, therefore, is something you'll see both Northerners and Southerners support in this debate, late 1840s and through much of the 1850s. The first big proponent of popular sovereignty was Lewis Cass, who you'll remember in the 1830s had been the guy who gave Andrew Jackson the idea for Indian removal. He is now a much older man and a key figure in the Democratic Party He ran for president in 1848, got the Democratic nomination, and popular sovereignty was his issue. He lost to Zachary Taylor, though, but he helped get that popular sovereignty idea out there. Another important politician of the time who became associated in the public mind with popular sovereignty for most of the rest of the 1850s is a senator from Illinois, a guy named Stephen Douglas. No relation to Frederick Douglass. They don't spell their last names the same. And of course, Frederick Douglass used to be a slave, and Stephen Douglas is a white dude. Stephen Douglas is going to be probably the most important Democrat of the 1850s. He's from Illinois. We're going to hear more about him later. But eventually, popular sovereignty became his big issue. He thought this was something that both the North and the South could go for, and he was hoping he had other issues that he was more worried about. And so he was hoping if he went for popular sovereignty that he could help sort of defuse the slavery issue and then get other things he wanted, like get rich, get a railroad. We'll hear more about that later. So those two guys, Cass first, the older Democrat, and Stephen Douglas later, the younger Democrat, helped push that popular sovereignty idea. But as I said, it's an idea that's popular in the North and in the South because they both thought they could get something from it, potentially. But there's a fifth point of view, and the fifth point of view about slavery that is growing as you get into the 1850s, which is a position of people who are very extremely in favor of slavery no matter what. There are people in politics as you get into the 1850s who come out of the South who are sick of having to defend slavery, who are convinced that you don't need to defend slavery because slavery is good for the country. And in fact, they believed that slavery should not be allowed to stop expanding anywhere. These people became known as the fire eaters, which is a reference to the rhetoric. People who were spewing such fiery rhetoric in favor of slavery coming out of the South, and this is a Southern only position. It will not surprise you probably to hear that the first well known fire eater was John C. Calhoun, who, ever since the 1830s, had tried to be the leading spokesperson for the South. If the big issue in the South is slavery, then you're darn tootin'. He is going to support slavery and support its expansion everywhere. In 1850, as these debates are going on, he's an elderly man. His last speech that he gave in the Senate was a speech, a fire eater speech, all the way down to his toes, in which he said that slavery must be allowed to take over all of the new territory, and the idea that it could be opposed was clearly in his mind unconstitutional and wrong for the country. He died shortly after giving that speech, but there were many, many other Southern fire eaters who sort of stepped up to fill the breach that he left behind. A lot of possibilities I could mention, but one guy that I am going to mention as another example of a fire eater is someone we're going to hear about later because he'll later be the president of the Confederacy when the Civil War starts. There's a senator from Mississippi named Jefferson Davis who became famous in this period. Southerners in particular love him because he defended slavery at all costs. He eventually got into presidential politics and he was in the cabinet in the 1850s. But throughout his public career, strongly defended the rights of the slave owners, strongly defended the idea of slavery, and he and other Southern fire eaters refused to consider any kind of compromise over the expansion of slavery. You look at those positions, and I mean, from abolitionists to fire eaters, there's a big distance, but there's so much complexity, different regions, different ideas. It's going to be very difficult for anybody to come up with a solution to this very complicated problem. What are we going to do with this new territory? And if that's the ideologies that are kicking around in the country, it's no surprise that it's difficult for the leadership of the country to come up with something that's going to satisfy everybody. But it doesn't help that the president who's dealing with this is this political naif, Zachary Taylor, who offered a pretty milquetoast proposal in 1850 and then couldn't get it passed through Congress because there's nobody who's really going to strongly support it. Instead, as the country is debating what to do with this new territory, and as people representing these five different philosophies are yelling at each other and pointing fingers at each other, and it seems pretty ugly, and people are starting to worry, is this just like in 1820? We were worried the country was going to fall apart over slavery then. It seems very similar, except it's 30 years later, and people are even more wound up over it. That's the real fear. Well, into the breach, as in 1820, steps Henry Clay. Clay initially had proposed, let's just keep the Missouri Compromise line, but it was clear that wasn't going to be good enough this time. And so in 1850, in the summer of 1850, as things got really, really bad, Clay offered one final compromise. He put together a proposal that he thought could pass through the South and the North because, like a generation earlier, it was something that would give both sides something that they wanted. Unfortunately, Clay is old. Clay doesn't have the same ability to twist arms, but also times have changed, and compromising is a lot harder in the 1850s than it was in the 1820s. Clay was not able to get Congress to accept a big package where there's a bunch of different things. Instead, as he disappears, he was old and declining and essentially retired that year as well and died not long afterwards. Stephen Douglas, this important Northern Democrat from Illinois, picked up Clay's ideas and instead of trying to pass them as one big compromise, was able to get them passed as individual bills. And thus, Clay starts and Douglas concludes the passage through Congress of what is referred to as the Compromise of 1850. Not as sexy of a name as the Missouri Compromise. This one, at least, it's easier to remember the year it happened. The Compromise of 1850 is probably a misnomer. Missouri Compromise had been one big compromise. The North got some stuff, the South got some stuff, and then they kind of had to agree to give up certain things. In 1850, when Clay wasn't able to get a similar bill passed and Douglas broke it into parts, he was able to get all the parts passed, and I'll explain the parts in a second. But he wasn't able to get a majority behind the whole idea of compromise. Instead, some of the parts the North liked, and they voted for those. Some of the parts the South liked, and they voted for those. But the stuff the North liked, the South didn't vote for. And the stuff the South liked, the North didn't vote for. And each of those individual parts, they passed because Douglas was able to get the support of a handful of people on the border who were just rooting for compromise in general. And so in the end, the different parts of the Compromise of 1850 passed, not because it was really a compromise where both parts of the country agreed to give up stuff. It passed because each part of the country dug in for the things they wanted, and then a handful of politicians in the middle voted to pass each of the parts, and they're the only ones who did any compromising. But it did pass. And after the different parts got enacted into law, people described the whole package as the Compromise of 1850, and they hoped they'd solve their problems, but they hadn't really. So the parts of the compromise. Clay originally had these as one big package. Douglas saw that wasn't going to work and broke it down into individual parts and got the parts passed. First, California. It was clear to everybody that people in California don't want to have slavery. So the first part of the Compromise of 1850 was admit California now as a non-slave state. End of discussion. Simple enough. Next, let's look at the rest of that territory. In Taylor's plan, he just called the whole thing New Mexico. In the Clay plan, which got passed by Douglas as a separate bill, they divided it into two parts. Later, it got broken down into even more parts. But at the time, they divided it into two parts. And then they're going to let popular sovereignty decide what's going to happen to those two parts eventually. That could be a pro-Northern thing because both of those parts could wind up with no slavery. After all, California, their neighbor, is not going to have slavery. And also, it's going to be hard to grow cotton there because it's mostly desert and mountains. But it opens the possibility also that the South could get those two parts, or maybe they would split it. So the popular sovereignty idea for the divided New Mexico territory opens up. Maybe the South's going to get something, maybe the North's going to get something, and so um, that's a possible compromise there. But that wasn't good enough for the North because they weren't certain that they were going to be able to keep slavery out of that area. So, as part of Clay's original big proposal, and Douglas got passed as a separate individual bill, many Northerners had been objecting to the fact that people were being bought and sold in D.C., that in the capital city, that the slave auctions were taking place. Slavery existed in D.C., but it seemed even more offensive to realize that buying and selling of human beings was taking place in the capital city. So, as part of the compromise, the they banned the sale of slaves in the capital city. They don't ban slavery. Slavery itself is going to continue in Washington all the way to the Civil War. But they banned the sale of slaves, which is an important victory for the North, a symbolic victory. And of course, anyone who might be a slave is going to at least know that in DC, at least, no one's going to buy and sell them. But that is going to be something that's going to help the North and therefore needs to be balanced out for something that's going to help the South. And so part of the Compromise of 1850, part of the original bill that was then broken out later by Douglas as a separate bill, Southerners had been very concerned about the fact that there were slaves that were running away to the North. And we talked about fugitive slaves and we talked about the Underground Railroad. Although not that effective for most of the slaves, it did still help some slaves get away, particularly slaves in the more northern part of the South. So in Maryland and Virginia, more and more slaves were escaping in the 1840s and 1850s. Southerners are very upset about that, and they want the government to help them track down those slaves and bring them back to slavery. There had been a law that existed for decades that requires the government to help slave owners track down their escaped slaves, but it was pretty weak, and the government didn't really do anything. Southerners want the government to help them more effectively. And so, as part of the omnibus, and then eventually as to sort of a separate bill, there's a stronger fugitive slave law that got enacted as part of the Compromise of 1850, which is going to put real teeth into the idea that the government is on the side of the slave owners, and the government is going to have to help slave owners track down their slaves when they escape to the North and bring them back to the South where they'll be slaves again. Put all those parts together. At first together, Clay tried them together, that didn't work, and then separated out, but eventually passed so that you can think of them kind of as if they're all part of the same thing. The North got some stuff that they wanted. The South got some stuff that they wanted, and then it's unclear who really wins in that New Mexico territory. We'll have to find out eventually. So it's sort of a compromise, and you can think of it as a compromise. But the fact that Douglas couldn't get it passed as one big compromise is a bad sign that politics and slavery and sectionalism are starting to get more complicated than even the most adroit politician is going to be able to resolve as you get into the 1850s. And the truth of the matter is, the Compromise of 1850, which isn't much of a compromise, the ink is barely dried on the individual pieces of legislation when a series of other events start to take place as the 1850s go on that make it harder and harder and harder for these two sections of the country to get along. We're going to pick up next class with something that at first will seem to have nothing to do with slavery, which is going to be about immigration. We'll get back to the politics of the 1850s, and I promise by the end of the next lecture, things are going to look pretty bad for the North and the South and for the chances of them staying together in this country. We're building up to a week from tonight is the Civil War. It's not looking good, folks. Hopefully they can figure out a way to solve their problems without shooting at each other. But every year when I get to it, they shoot at each other. So, we'll see how that goes. Thank you very much. Have a good weekend. Make sure you're working on your papers, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.